Lessons in Logic, video number 25. We're now learning our third and final method of testing categorical syllogisms for validity. Our first method was the mood figure method. Second method was the Venn diagram method, and our new method is the 6 rules method. Let's first learn the rules. There are 6 rules you can use to test categorical syllogisms for validity. By the way, I'm gonna, for a change, let this video assume that you've been watching earlier videos and you know things like, what is a categorical syllogism? How do you put it into standard form? How many terms are there in a categorical syllogism? And you don't need me to explain all this to you again. Explaining it again is a useful review. I think it actually does help, which is one reason I allow myself to keep doing it, but I do it too much. This time I'm going to try to not let myself do it at all. A valid categorical syllogism will not break any of these 6 rules. Every invalid categorical syllogism will break one or more of these rules. A valid categorical syllogism, 1, must be a standard form syllogism containing exactly 3 terms. Some fallacies that break this rule don't necessarily have names. Like there's the fallacy of 4 terms. You could have 4 terms instead of 3. One fallacy that breaks this rule that has a name is called equivocation. That means using a word or a phrase that does not have the same meaning, such that it does not refer to the same categories. When of course the argument would presume, the argument would need it to have the same meaning and refer to the same categories. Like all animals who are rational are men, women are not men, therefore women are not rational. This is something of a classic, at least it's a classic for me. I've been using this example of equivocation for a long time. We'll look at that one again in a moment. Rule number 2, in a valid categorical syllogism, the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. Now, I think we should review this because it probably hasn't come up since quite some time ago when we first introduced categorical propositions. A term is distributed in a categorical proposition when the proposition says something about every member of the class denoted by the term. Now, since it's harder for most of us to understand these lofty general statements, easier for us to understand by way of example, let's give a good example. If I say no guinea pigs or hamsters, I've distributed the term guinea pigs and I've distributed the term hamsters because the statement no guinea pigs or hamsters is telling us something about every guinea pig and about every hamster. Any E-form categorical proposition, any proposition of the form no X or Y, distributes both terms. Now, what about A's? An A-form categorical proposition distributes the first term, the subject term, but not the predicate term. All X or Y is the form of an A-form categorical proposition, is the A-form categorical proposition. So if I say all guinea pigs are fuzzy rodents, I haven't said anything about all fuzzy rodents, but I've said something about all guinea pigs. The I-form categorical proposition, some X or Y, doesn't distribute anything. If I say some guinea pigs are rodents, some guinea pigs are hamsters, some Leibnizians are Platonists, whatever, I haven't told you anything about all guinea pigs, hamsters, Leibnizians, or Platonists. The O-form categorical proposition is the one that's tricky. My advice is if you have difficulty with it, try one more time and then give up trying to understand it. But just remember this, just remember the rule. Memorize if necessary the rule. Memorize to remember if necessary the chart. Which terms are distributed? A, E, I, O. Let me just type up the chart. A-form propositions distribute the subject term, but not the predicate term. This would have been a little simpler if I just did this approach. Don't trust the chart you have before you. It's not finished yet. There we go. Now the chart's finished. So actually what I memorized, the chart I made in, I guess, my undergrad notes or something, was S, S and P, none, P. A-form propositions distribute S. E-form propositions distribute both. I-form propositions distribute either. O-form propositions distribute P. S and P, none P. But this is a dangerous way of thinking now that we're talking about categorical syllogisms, because when we're doing categorical syllogisms, S doesn't just denote subject term of some categorical syllogism, categorical proposition, and P, predicate term of some categorical proposition. It's specifically the subject term, predicate term of the conclusion. So actually, don't do what I did. It's likely to confuse you. It'll work as long as you remember how you're using the symbols. Early on in introductions to categorical logic, S and P are just symbols for any old subject term, any old predicate term. But when we get to categorical syllogisms, we introduce a new symbolization scheme. S represents specifically the subject term of the conclusion, i.e. the minor term of a syllogism. P represents the predicate term of the conclusion, i.e. the major term. But that very major term might be the subject term of the first premise, and it will be if the mood of the category, if the figure of the categorical syllogism is figure 1 or figure 3, if I'm not mistaken. So this chart I have on the screen is probably a little more useful. My suggestion is, if necessary, just memorize the chart whether you understand it or not. It's easy enough to understand. The statement, all guinea pigs are fuzzy friends, tells us something about all guinea pigs, but not about all fuzzy friends. The E-form proposition, no guinea pigs or hamsters, tells us something about all guinea pigs, all hamsters. The I-form proposition, some guinea pigs or rodents, tells us something. It tells us nothing about all guinea pigs or all rodents. Now, it's actually true that all guinea pigs are rodents, but the proposition, some guinea pigs or rodents, doesn't tell us that. And then the O-form proposition distributes the predicate term. Now, let's get back on track. The O-form proposition distributes the predicate term. Why does it distribute the predicate term? If I say some guinea pigs are not pets, have I told you something about all guinea pigs? No. Have I told you something about all pets? Actually, yes. Because I told you that all pets are not those particular guinea pigs. That's it. That's the only explanation I can give you. An O-form proposition distributes the predicate term because it tells you that every member of the category, every member of the class denoted by that predicate term is not those particular members of the class denoted by the subject term that we're talking about. Or once again, some teacups are not currently cold. This one is certainly not. Some teacups are not currently cold. Does not tell us anything about all teacups, but it does tell us that those particular teacups that are not currently cold are not any of those things that are currently cold. In other words, it tells us about all things currently cold, that none of them is those some teacups we're talking about. So the predicate term is distributed by O-form propositions. Just remember and memorize this information if you must, with or without understanding it. But it's not that hard to understand. I think you'll probably be okay to understand it, most of you. But it's okay to just remember the rules without understanding them sometimes. I'm afraid that's life. Now, the fallacy that breaks this rule is the undistributed middle. What rule? Wait, what were we talking about? Let's not lose track. After I did all this review, I wasn't planning. This is the second rule that every categorical syllogism that is valid will follow. Every syllogism that breaks this rule is not valid. The middle term must be distributed. The undistributed middle is the fallacy that breaks that rule. Now, let me explain this rule briefly. It should make sense. It's actually very simple. In a categorical syllogism, you're trying to demonstrate some conclusion about two categories, about the minor term and the major term, the first term of the conclusion, the second term of the conclusion. The strategy of a categorical syllogism is to use some third term to make that conclusion work. You're trying to draw some relation between the S term and the P term of that is to say, the minor term and the major term, first and second term of the conclusion. And you need some third thing to connect them. Minor term here, major term here, some third thing in the middle that allows you to demonstrate that relationship that the conclusion demonstrates. Now, if that third thing in the middle is not, if none of your premises tells us something about everything in that third thing in the middle, then you just won't be able to make the connection. For a categorical syllogism to successfully demonstrate a connection between the minor term and the major term, it's got to use this middle term to draw the connection. And that means you have to say something about everything in the middle term. Otherwise, whatever connection you make between the minor term and the major, the minor term and the middle term might not actually follow through with the connection you make between the middle term and the major term. Okay, so once again, a categorical syllogism is trying to draw some connection between the minor term, to make some, state some relationship between the minor term and the major term. And in order to make the connection between the minor term and the major term, we resort to a third term, and the minor premise is going to connect the minor term with the middle term. The major premise is going to connect the major term with the middle term. And if neither premise is something about everything denoted by that middle term, there's no way of being sure that that minor to middle, middle to major path is going to actually work. You'll get halfway and then you won't be able to make the second half of the journey. I hope that makes sense. If it didn't, forget it. Just stick with the rules, whether you understand them or not. Rule number 3, in a valid categorical syllogism, a term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises. This is very easy to explain. An argument is valid if the premises cannot be true and the conclusion false at the same time, which means all the information in the conclusion is already in the premises, which means a term distributed in the conclusion is just, which means that information about a category that's in the conclusion must be somewhere in the premises, which means that since distribution is information about a category, that distribution has to happen in the premises as well. All right, so a fallacy that breaks this rule we call illicit process. When the improperly illicitly distributed term is the minor premise, we call it an illicit minor. When it's the major term, we call it an illicit major. I don't know if I like those names. I don't even keep them in my head. I don't keep those names of fallacies in my head. Hang on, let me jot something down here. All right, we'll get back to that in a moment. All right, so rule 1, categorical syllogism must be standard form with exactly 3 terms. Rule 2, middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. Rule 3, any term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises, because all information in the conclusion has to be in the premises somewhere. And the fallacy that breaks this rule we call illicit process. And specifically illicit minor, illicit major, depending on which term is distributed in the conclusion. Now, we can go back to this chart here. If the conclusion is an A-form proposition, then that minor term needs to be distributed in its premise. If the conclusion is an E-form proposition, then the minor and major term have to be distributed in both their premises. If the conclusion is an I-form proposition, this rule doesn't matter at all. We're good, no problem. The rule isn't broken. If the conclusion is an O-form proposition, then the major term will have to be distributed in one of the premises. All right, let's move on. Rule number 4. A valid categorical syllogism must not have 2 negative premises. All right. Valid categorical syllogism does not have 2 negative premises. The fallacy that breaks this rule is called the fallacy of exclusive premises. I don't know if I even want to say anything about this. A negative premise, I need to say at least this much, and then maybe I'll move on. I don't know that I have any further commentary to explain this one. It's just one of the rules, and if I know the explanation, I can't find it in my head right now. A valid categorical syllogism does not have 2 negative premises. So without explaining it, explaining why this rule is so, let me just tell you should remember it, and tell you what it means. A negative premise means an E or an O premise, that's all. You can't have 2 E premises or 2 O premises or an O and an E premise. You must have one premise that's an A or an I, okay? That's the rule. In a valid categorical syllogism, if a premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. The fallacy that breaks this rule is given the thoroughly boring but perfectly functional name, fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Now, I think once again, I'm not able to explain why this rule is the case. If I have an explanation in my head, I can't find it. There's a decent chance it's never been in my head. This is a rule. Syllogism should follow it. This one I can explain, but I don't want to. You can go back and watch a video on existential import if you really want to. This is not actually a rule if you're going to use an Aristotelian strategy testing categorical syllogisms for validity. But we call it an existential fallacy when a conclusion is universal, but the premises are not universal. Now, what this means practically is just assuming you're not an Aristotelian, or assuming you're acting like most logic students and logic teachers act and following the rules of most logic classes. If your conclusion is E or A, well, you better have an A or an E, or an E or an A premise. You can't have a universal conclusion, an A or E conclusion, unless at least one of your premises is universal. Wait a minute, wait, I'm sorry. Sorry, I totally botched that. If the premises are universal, the conclusion must be universal. Oh, wait, I've totally botched this. Hang on, let me rewind. Again, I'm not going to do much to explain this. You can go back to the videos in Existential Import. In a valid categorical syllogism, if the premises are both universal, the conclusion must be universal. That means if your conclusion is I or O, you better have an I or O premise. That's what this means. Sorry. If the conclusion is particular, you need a particular premise. You cannot have particular premises drawn from universal conclusions. I'll say one thing to explain this, but again, going back and watching a video on Existential Import is probably more useful than it's probably useful if you're puzzled by this and want to understand this. But without reviewing the whole issue of existential import, a particular premise tells us that something exists. When we're not Aristotelians, when we're using the modern perspective on existential import, we think that universal premises do not tell us that things exist. They only tell us that things do not exist. And that's why in Venn diagrams, the universal premises only shade regions to indicate non-existence, emptiness, nothingness. We don't use an X for universal premise. A particular premise gets an X. X marks the spot where something exists. A universal premise just gets shading to indicate that there's nothing there. No M or P means nothing is an M and also a P. No S or M means nothing is an S and also an M. All M or S means nothing is an M but not an S. All S or M means nothing is an S but not an M. All P or M means nothing is a P but not an M. So they're only telling us what does not exist, the universal premises. So if your conclusion is telling us that something does exist by giving us a particular premise, well, you need a premise that also tells you that something does exist. So you can't have two universal premises like A's and E's, two A's, two E's, or one of each. You can't have that and then have a particular conclusion, I or no. That's the rule. It's an existential fallacy otherwise. But again, like I keep saying in this series, if you encounter an argument where we can reasonably assume that the person making the argument and any of that person's listeners themselves reasonably assume that certain things exist that the argument is talking about, and if the conclusion is particular and the premises are universal, you're okay. Just treat it as an argument that has an unstated premise and chart the extra premise. All guinea pigs are fuzzy friends. All fuzzy friends are creatures that make good pets. Therefore, some creatures that make good pets are guinea pigs. That's a valid syllogism, actually, except it's not really a syllogism. It's a valid argument, but there's an unstated premise. Some guinea pigs exist. So what you want to do is put it in standard form. Let me type it up and then we'll do it properly. Let's see, there we go. All guinea pigs are fuzzy friends. All fuzzy friends are creatures that make good pets. So some creatures that make good pets are guinea pigs. Who on earth would make this argument and why? Outside of a logic class where you're just looking for examples, I don't know, maybe someone who really likes reptiles overstates his case and says, no good pets are fuzzy friends. And someone who likes guinea pigs has to explain, no, actually, surely you must admit guinea pigs are fuzzy friends and fuzzy friends make good pets. Actually, no, that's not even the right scenario. Never mind the scenario. I'm sure there's some plausible, no, there's some possible scenario where someone might actually have to make this argument, but who cares? We don't care about that. We care about whether the premises guarantee the conclusion. So we'll get back to this, and if my brain holds up, I'll illustrate how you would chart this argument. Not chart, we're not doing Venn diagrams. How you would test this argument for validity, but how you can treat it as a valid argument, just not technically a syllogism because there's an unstated premise that guinea pigs exist. All right, is that it? Good, that's it with the rules. Good, now let's move on. So every categorical syllogism should follow these rules. If a syllogism breaks any of these rules, it's invalid. If a syllogism does not break any of these rules, it's valid. And now to state the method formally. The method is really simple. Put an argument, put a syllogism into standard form using SP and M to symbolize the minor, major, and middle terms. Check to make sure that the syllogism follows the rules. If it follows all the rules, state that it's valid. If it breaks any rule, state all rules the syllogisms break. State all rules the syllogism breaks and state that it's invalid and you're done. Unless your teacher wants you to name the fallacies, which I suppose could occasionally happen. All right, so now let's practice with the scheme of abbreviation, which you recall is where we formalize the argument and formalize the argument and look at the argument form by itself, pattern of reasoning by itself, without looking at the original argument, by symbolizing the argument. And we symbolize it in an orderly fashion and make a lot fewer mistakes by first using this key, this legend, this, as I call it, scheme of abbreviation. Certainly not my language. Where did I get it from? Some logic textbook or logic teacher years ago. All right, so first, for this argument, no Leibnizians are leftists, all Marxists are leftists, so no Leibnizians are Marxists. And if you don't know what a Leibnizian is, great, doesn't matter. Is the argument valid? Do the premises guarantee the conclusion? Well, we'll find out, won't we? No Leibnizians are leftists. No Leibnizians are Marxists is our conclusion, which means our minor term S is Leibnizians and our major term Marxists will be represented by P, Leibnizians represented by S, and M will, of course, be the middle term, the one of the premises, but not the conclusion, leftist. So now the argument in standard form is no SRM, all PRM, so no SRP, except that's not in standard form because the premises are not in order. Now the argument's in standard form, where S is Leibnizians, P is Marxists, and M is leftists. The argument, no Leibnizians are leftists, all Marxists are leftists, so no Leibnizians are Marxists is put into standard form. Thus, all P are M, no S or M, so no S or P. Now, does this break any rule? Do we have three terms? Yes. There's no equivocation here. Is any term distributed in the conclusion, and is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? The middle term is distributed in the second premise. There are both terms distributed in the conclusion. Well, the minor term is distributed in its premise, and the major term is distributed in its premise because the major term is the first term, the predicate term of its premise. The major premise distributes the major term because the major term is the subject term of the major premise, and that premise is an A form proposition which distributes its first term. So rules 1, 2, and 3 are fine. Do we have two negative premises? No, our first premise is positive, it's an A. Our second premise is negative. First premise is A. If a premise is negative, the conclusion is negative. We do have a negative premise. So do we have a negative conclusion? Yes, we do. E is the universal negative form of a categorical proposition, and a premise is negative, but so is a conclusion. No problem. Koi ba nahi momantai. Valid categorical syllogism have two negative premises, premise negative, conclusion negative. And finally, if the premise is universal, is the conclusion universal? Yes. So this argument breaks no rules, and it is not invalid, it is valid. Now, this is a strategy, I could almost say a formula, I strongly recommend for using this method. After the argument, you want to symbolize SP and M, then restate the argument formally. All know some. State the rules that are broken and state whether it's valid or invalid. Just don't write valid, invalid, and then neglect to scratch one out. So this is what you should do for any syllogism when you're testing for validity using this method. All right, now let's do the next one a little more quickly, I hope. Some guinea pigs are good pets is our conclusion. So guinea pigs is the minor term, major term, good pets. Fuzzy friends, middle term. Our argument is some guinea pigs are fuzzy friends. Some fuzzy friends are good pets, so some guinea pigs are good pets. Some SRP is the conclusion. And some SRM is the middle, sorry, the minor premise. The major premise is some MRP. No, wait, something is amiss. Let me look over this again. Some fuzzy friends are good pets. Some MRP is the major premise. Okay, we're good. No problem there. Some guinea pigs are fuzzy friends. Some SRM. Okay, this looks fine. Yeah, I think we got this right. No good, no problem. Now there's going to be a rule broken here. There's something wrong with this argument. Yes, I can see it already. The middle term is not distributed. So let's do this in a more orderly fashion now. Let me make it a little easier to do this without scrolling up and down so much. All right, here are our rules. Now we're looking at this guinea pig argument. At this point, all we need to do is look at this. We've symbolized the argument. We've done such a darn good job of it that now we have just the argument pattern, the way of reasoning about things, just the argument form to look at. So now, what rules does it break? Are there exactly 3 terms? Yes. Is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? No, no term is distributed. These are all I-form propositions. No term is distributed anywhere. Now that's good for rule 3, but rule 2 is broken. And actually, it's enough to demonstrate the argument is invalid by stopping there, but let's be thorough and keep going. Actually, if you're taking a logic class, it's possible your teacher doesn't care. If you demonstrate invalidity by one rule, that's fine. I think it's better. I would probably require this of my students to state all rules the syllogism breaks. I don't know. Maybe some teachers are a little more, what's the word? A little less rigid on that point. All right, so guinea pig argument, some MRP, some SRM, so some SRP. First rule not broken, second rule broken, third rule not broken. Do we have 2 negative premises? Nope, no problem with the fourth rule. The premises are not universal. 6th rule's fine. 5th rule, premise is negative, conclusion is negative. Premises are both positive. So this premise breaks only rule 2. It's the undistributed middle fallacy. The argument is invalid, and you better say so. Don't forget to say it's invalid or valid at the end. All right, no true politician. Just one moment. This is a slightly better setup. For any categorical syllogism we're testing for validity using the 6 rules method, you should be prepared to do this. Give the scheme of abbreviation for SPM. Give the minor premise, major premise, and conclusion symbolized using SP and M. State which rules are broken and then state whether it's valid or invalid. And if your teacher tells you to, also name the fallacy. All right, no true politician is an honest statesman. Abraham Lincoln was an honest statesman, so Abraham Lincoln was not a true politician. This is one where we really want to avoid those rookie mistakes with time and singular plural. The minor term is not Abraham Lincoln. And the conclusion is not Abraham Lincoln was not a true politician. Not if we're going to put this in a formal fashion. The minor term is people who are Abraham Lincoln. And the conclusion has to be present tense, always present tense. Your only copula are and are not. So you could say people who are Abraham Lincoln are not a true politician. That doesn't make any sense. Not true politicians. We're getting closer, but we're not there yet. The major term is going to be true politicians. So now let's, before we identify the minor term, actually let's do that now, that's easy. The minor term is honest statesman, make it plural. Sorry, the middle term is honest statesman, make it plural. Now, the conclusion, people who are Abraham Lincoln are not true politicians. That's not right. The conclusion, first of all, you want to symbolize it. So let's say S R not P. That's how the conclusion is stated in the original argument, but that's not standard form, S or not P. Do you see what's wrong with that? Well, it's that thing I keep telling you. Once you make it, once you make your terms plural, and in this case by saying people who are, or things that are, or whatever you need to, you also need to actually, let's just stop there. That's what you do. But you also need to follow through on it, which means find out if it's universal or particular. Are we talking about all people who are Abraham Lincoln? We are. So actually, we could say all S are not P, and then we're getting the information across, but it's still not standard form. How do we take a universal premise, a universal proposition that's negative, like all S are not P, all people who are Abraham Lincoln are not true politicians, and put it in standard form? Well, we can't say all or not. If you're going to say all, you have to say are. And if you're going to say a universal negative proposition, you have to say no. So for those of you who are thinking, I'm confused, shouldn't he just be saying no S or P? Good, good. I was hoping to not confuse you while hoping to catch people who were already confused and unconfuse them. This is the proper way. No S or P, where S is people who are Abraham Lincoln and P is true politicians, is the correct way to symbolize the proposition Abraham Lincoln was not a true politician. No people who are Abraham Lincoln are true politicians. You might, if you like, say people who are true politicians, and you could almost say were, but I think we need to just put everything in present tense here. All right, so what's the minor premise? Something about, oh, bad job, Mark. Silly me. My apologies for that egregious error. You must have them in the proper order. So the major premise should be written first. So I am so sorry. This is the format you should use for testing a categorical syllogism for validity using the 6 rules method. First, always symbolize the minor, major, middle terms, then give the argument major premise first, minor premise second, then conclusion. Using that symbolization system, then state which rules are broken, then state whether it's valid or invalid. And if your teacher requires you to name the fallacy, no true politician, actually your logic textbook homework, I think the logic textbook homework sometimes require you to name the fallacy. All right, no true politician is not a statesman. All right, is that our minor premise or major premise? How are we going to symbolize it? It's no PRM. So that's our major premise, no PRM. And the minor premise is all SRM. There we go. No true politician is not a statesman. Abraham Lincoln was not a statesman, so Abraham Lincoln was not a true politician. Is correctly symbolized as follows, where S is people who are Abraham Lincoln, P is people who are true politicians, and M are honest statesmen. No PRM, no people who are true politicians are honest statesmen. All S are M, all people who are Abraham Lincoln are honest statesmen. So no S or P, no people who are Abraham Lincoln are true politicians. And once you have it properly symbolized, once you've done all that lovely work, forget everything that came before if you must, or at any rate, don't concentrate on it. Just look at the argument form, it's all we need. And now our exciting rules. Do we have 3 terms? Yes. Is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? Yes. The first premise distributes the middle term because an E premise distributes every term. No problem so far. A term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. Both terms are distributed in the premises. Well, our minor premise distributes our minor term. Our major premise distributes our major term, no problem. Do we have two negative premises? No. So rule 4 is fine. Do we have a negative premise? Yes. And we also have a negative conclusion, the E and E, premise and conclusion. If the premises are both universal, the conclusion must be universal. Premises is universal, conclusion is universal. No rules broken. This syllogism is valid. Yay! No women or men, all rational animals are men, so no women are rational animals. Okay, so this is that the ridiculous equivocation fallacy. So it's hard to even know how to symbolize this. You could possibly do this. You could just symbolize the argument, act like there's no fallacy, and then go back and state that there was an equivocation fallacy and give an explanation since you symbolized the argument and ended up with a form that didn't have that fallacy. So S would be women, rational animals would be P, the major term. M would be men, and of course this is the old Aristotelian definition of a human being as a rational animal. And this would be the old school English gender neutral use of the word men as just referring to human beings in the second premise. Not politically correct, but it's how people have talked for centuries, millennia. You have to be prepared to deal with sentences like this, whether you like them or not. Okay, major premise. I mean, state the sentences the way you like if you want, but know what they mean when you encounter a statement like all rational animals are men. It means human beings. Major premise. That's the old school gender neutral masculine. Major premise, focus on the major premise, Mark. The major premise is the one about rational animals and men, and it's the premise written second in the original argument, all PRM. The minor premise is the one about women and men, no SRM. So the conclusion, no SRP, would seem to follow, I would imagine, but let's check the other rules, except for that fallacy, but let's first check the other rules. Do we have a middle term distributed in a premise? Yes, the second premise distributes the middle term. Is there a term distributed in the conclusion? Yes, but both terms in the conclusion are distributed in their respective premises. Do we have two negative premises? No. Do we have a negative conclusion? Yes. So no problem for rule 5. Rule 6, if the premises are both universal, the conclusion is universal, yes. So this syllogism only breaks the first rule. So if you're going to do it this way, and I said this is a way you could, a way that would almost work. I could almost suggest doing this. Represent the argument as if it's valid. State, show the form, show this valid argument form here, and then state that it actually breaks rule 1, but give an explanation. The explanation could go something like this. This is an equivocation fallacy breaking rule 1. The argument form we ended up with is actually valid, but we only got that form by ignoring the equivocation in the premises, where the word men means, what does it mean? No women or men in the first premise, adult male humans. In the major premise. But the word men means human beings in the minor premise. And so the argument is therefore decreed to be invalid by virtue of committing an equivocation fallacy. Actually, this might be the best way you could do it. Now, let me see if I can suggest an alternative strategy. An alternative strategy is to since you've actually got two terms here where they look like one term, you've got the same noun or noun phrase, but they do not denote the same category of things. You can give a different symbolization scheme, like M1 for adult male human beings, the way the word men is used in the first premise, and M2 for simply human beings, the way the term is used in the minor premise. And then you state the major premise, major premise, all PRM2, all rational animals are human beings. Minor premise, no SRM1, no women or adult male humans. It's also politically incorrect. Let's see. And then the conclusion, of course, no SRP. And behold, now we have, well, I don't know. We have to look at the other rules again, probably. But do we have an equivocation fallacy? Yes, we have four terms. You can just say, rule 1 is broken. And if you need an explanation, just say, we have four terms. Here you're not actually calling the argument out for its equivocation fallacy. You're acting like its only fallacy was having four terms rather than three. That's fine. At this point, you've done quite enough to expose the folly of the original argument. All right, so what the other rules? Is the middle term distributed? I don't know. There's two terms masquerading as one middle term. One of those terms is not distributed, and that would be M2. What about our rule 3? A term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. No problem there. Rule 4, two negative premises. We must not have two negative premises, no problem. If the premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative, no problem. If the premises are both universal, the conclusion must also be universal. No problem. So you could construe this argument as being so ridiculous that it has two fallacies and not just the one equivocation fallacy. It's certainly invalid. So there you go. Terrible argument, invalid, and here is one very respectable way of punishing the argument for its sins, or at least calling it out for its sins. I think I like this way better than the way I did first. Either way is fine. If you're taking a logic class and you encounter an argument of similar fallacy, I have no idea what your teacher will prefer. Talk to your teacher. All right, let's see if we can do this one more quickly. All guinea pigs are fuzzy, etc. But on second thoughts, let's not do that one more quickly. In fact, I tried doing it. I made a terrible mistake. Disaster ensued. I got wrong answers. Let's do it again in a different video and practice and review a lot of ground on categorical syllogisms in that video. I'll see you there.